Hello, and welcome to the next edition of Revive and Thrive, a podcast for physician fathers about burnout and little actionable steps that you can do to work around it. And I'm your host, Joshua Blum. This is episode number 12, and we're going to be talking about the next letter of the alphabet. So if you've been following these, every single episode represents a different letter. We're going through the alphabet A to Z, and this week is the letter L. And L stands for love. Aw, it's not quite what you think. We're bound together by a love of a number of different things, not the least of which is probably our children. But we're not going to be talking about that today. Yes, people will wade through a river of shit for the ones they love, but that's pretty obvious probably. I'm a child psychiatrist by training, and I will say that I don't think I've ever met a parent who did not love their children. Maybe not necessarily always the best parents or parents who could not, do the best by their children in the way they would want to. And some who definitely had trouble kind of seeing and accepting their children for who they are, not who they wanted them to be. But still, I don't think I've ever met a parent who didn't on some level love their children and want their children to have a better life for them. So again, that's kind of a given. And we are going to be talking about something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about the idea of self-love. Now, I know what you're thinking when you hear that. This is not necessarily going to be an episode about the importance of waxing your pole or something like that, although, not necessarily unimportant either. It's just an idea that comes from sort of something that as physicians, we are sort of given our worth and priority in society by being helpful to other people. This idea of helping other people and being to some degree selfless. So when you think about that if that becomes a big part of your identity, then that often will mean that there's some part of you, your own needs, that don't get met. Now, everybody who's been through medical school and residency will tell you that personally. Of course, any period of difficult training, there has to be for it to be probably worth a whole lot. I mean, you have to have some sacrifice involved because there's just only so much time in the day. But even so, one of the things that happens a lot is that very idea of your self-worth in some way is related to the good you do for other people. It's a part of a helping profession. It's a part of a lot of service professions, if you think about it. So that's what we're going to be touching on today. The other thing, too, is that as a father, there's another sort of thing. So if we think about traditional male-female dynamics, obviously things are different in different parts of the world, different in different times of human society, and they're different as we are speaking. But if you're listening to this and you're from the West, and you're listening to this in the year it was recorded, 2023, then chances are, in some way, shape, or form, you were influenced by some of the modes and ideas of society that have been sort of at least mainstream. And, even if we grew up with a different sort of family background or different culture in our individual family, societal roles at large don't escape us. This is why when we talk about things like racial issues and so forth, it can be tricky because even if we don't necessarily hold those views true ourselves, we do have to acknowledge that it might be different in other parts of society, right? And on some levels, those things can influence people, right? So if you think about some traditional male-female roles, for a long time, at least in, a lot of parts of Western society, there was a very distinct way that the division of labor would go. Women would take care of children and they would be at home. Men would do things outside and they were working. Now that system, that has a lot of its issues, but it's the way it was for in many places, in many parts of the world. There's some of that sort of patriarchal view, right, of the way things typically go. That particular division of labor obviously has changed a lot, and it has its issues, but they are one of those things that we can't necessarily always escape from. It's not unusual, I think, for many men to still have some view in somewhere in the consciousness that they need to be a provider. Maybe not sole provider, maybe not even majority, but they need to be providing for their family in some way. And you could argue that that's a healthy part of any kind of partnership where you have two partners And they're both providing in various ways for each other. And, if they have children, then they're children. I think in reality, there ends up being some splitting of hairs sometimes that comes about in relationships where one person feels like they do end up doing more than the other, and so forth. But it's part of a relationship. There's going to be some things that you have to do to kind of sustain the whole thing. So if we think about that traditional view of man as provider, that also kind of implies a few things too, right? Because it means that you're working specifically for your family. Again, you may not be, contributing 100% or even the majority for it, but you're working with a specific goal of helping these people who are on some level dependent on you. If they're children, then they are literally dependents, right? The way you file your taxes or whatever. But, your partner may depend on you for other things too. It may not be solely financial. It may be emotional, social, whatever. There's that idea, right? If we think about that, what does that sort of mean? It means on some level that your own basic needs may in fact come at the end of the day. This comes first. I work first because that allows me to put food on the table and pay the bills, for this particular reason. And then my own particular needs may in fact come last. Your own satisfaction from your job, the fact that you want to go to work or not is sort of immaterial because you kind of need the finances that work provides. What you might do in your free time, all these kinds of things like that can factor into it. When you have a weekend, the fact that, I'd really actually love to just decompress and sit in front of the TV and veg out, or do something by myself and not really do anything with the family because you're worn out and you're tired, but you have some family obligations too, right? Because it's more than just you. So those kind of needs often get pushed aside. When that happens for too long, then we start to either forget them, or we don't really forget them, but we find other ways of doing them. So when you put that together with a physician where that's sort of built into the profession, you get sort of a double whammy, I think, for many, many of us, where on one hand, we're working something specifically to provide for our family in some way. We may not necessarily get full appreciation for that, because that, from either kids or your partner, because, that's just what you do. That's the given. And then there's also the part that comes from the job itself, where your own personal needs are sort of secondary. We talked, it was a couple episodes back, we talked about eating lunch, right? This is one of those things that, for example, when I was in medical school and through much of residency, I almost never saw attendings actually eat anything because they're like, I have patients, so I'm going to do that. So your own personal needs are being, pushed aside for supposedly the good of other people. And you can do that. And you can do that for quite a while. But eventually that wears on you. We all have a certain need for some basic things: food, air, water, or other fluids, love / affection, sex, physical movement like exercise, something to do, something to occupy ourselves. Those are all really important things. And if we don't have those basic things, either we'll spend time looking for them when we could otherwise be doing whatever we're trying to do more efficiently, or it'll start to eat us up probably inside. There'll be a lot of resentment, or why can't I do that? So that's what I kind of mean by the self-love thing. We sometimes will think of, you hear that term being thrown around like this is a really narcissistic person or that kind of stuff like that. There is a narcissistic personality disorder that people can be diagnosed with. But you'll hear that term, being thrown around a lot, like in the lay public or whatever. And often it has a negative connotation. In the Greek myth, Narcissus was a person who was so kind of enraptured by his own reflection that he died, because he didn't need anything. He didn't drink anything. He was looking at himself in the water for so long. So it has a tragic kind of air to it as well, right? The idea that someone is going to suffer because of the extent of their love for themselves. Often when we're looking at narcissistic kinds of issues, like in an actual clinical sense, it's actually a very, very different thing. People are sort of craving affection and craving recognition and so forth because they're not getting it in some other way. They didn't get it when they were younger. They don't feel that way themselves, and therefore they seek it out. That's a whole separate thing. One thing just to keep in mind is that when we think of self-esteem, that's actually sort of healthy narcissism, right? That's the idea that we need certain things and we have to prioritize those things because that helps us function at our best. And so we feel good about ourselves for doing those things. because those are basic things, right? We wouldn't necessarily criticize somebody for seeking basic things like eating and sleeping and so forth. Sometimes people get criticized when those things get taken to excess or the opposite, but they are basic needs. So if those basic needs are not getting met, again, they're going to need to be met some other way. So what can you do about some of this stuff? Recognizing that selflessness is not necessarily a good thing, and selfishness is not necessarily a bad thing. I think there was a couple of episodes ago we talked about looking at things that you like to do in your work or exploring things that you might be interested in doing. Being selfish about your own learning and prioritizing that aspect of it is not necessarily a bad thing, because if it's something that you need to know or want to know, and it's going to make you better at whatever you do, let's say it's going to make you a better physician, then it's an investment in time and sometimes in money or other resources to achieve that. Let's say that you need to invest time and money and energy into something that's kind of critical for everybody in the family, or if not critical, at least beneficial. Let's just say you have a part of your home that's falling apart and it's rotting and it's letting in water and it's creating a lot of discomfort. It's creating, potential expense. You may need to put aside some time and money and other resources to fix that, even though it's probably going to be an inconvenience to everybody. You're going to have people at the home fixing it. You may have to work extra to support the expense of that and so forth. But it's an investment, right? And it's kind of the same idea. When we invest in ourselves, we become better men. We become better physicians. We ultimately become better fathers. We ultimately become better husbands. I think when we try to be totally selfless 100% of the time, that's when, even if we're successful in being quote unquote good citizens, we have to watch out for, well, what is that actually doing to ourselves? So I guess that's the thing I would want to leave with you, is to think about the things that you may have given up to get to this point, and to think about is there a way to reintegrate some of those things into your life? Maybe you're not working at this point. Maybe at this point you're injured, you're on disability, you're taking some time off between jobs. Maybe you're thinking about changing career. Maybe you're deciding to take a break from medicine just altogether. Maybe you're on paternity leave, whatever. I mean, the reasons are not important for this necessarily. Your identity most likely is still as a physician. Your identity probably is still as a father, but it may look a little bit different. I experienced a little bit of this when I was a stay-at-home father for a little while after my first child was born. And during the daytime, I stayed at home to take care of her. I would work some odd hours in the evening and on weekends, but it was not a steady thing. And the decision to do that, I remember causing a fair amount of flack from colleagues, some aspects of family, and then some other people. So you have to think about, even if you're totally like, well, I don't care what other people think, these things may still affect you. And I think it's all the more complicated, when your particular situation doesn't necessarily align with the traditional one. So I think acknowledging that as well is also important. So I would think about things you may have given up, things you would like to reintegrate into your life in some way, and then look at, is there a way to make that happen? Is there a way, even in a small bit, does it require me to then have a discussion with my spouse about that, to make time or cut back or whatever, so I can get this basic need met. Maybe it's something very basic like eating and sleeping and so forth. We talked about that before. Maybe it's something a little more metaphorical, like a hobby or certain thing that you like to do that helps keep you centered. But when we push those things down, they don't stay down for long. They just seep back up in some other way. So these basic needs are that because they're needs. And so acknowledging that and making room for that is not necessarily a bad thing. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. And I hope you guys have a good week and a good weekend. Thanks for listening.